My name is Cale Blackthorn, and I should have died that night by the ceremonial fire. The flames still dance behind my eyelids when I close them, casting shadows that remind me of the moment everything changed. The moment I discovered what it truly meant to be a warrior, and what it cost to prove it. The harvest moon hung full and blood-red above our village when the feast began. Our tribe, the Ironwood clan, had survived another brutal winter in the northern mountains, and tradition demanded we celebrate with stories of valor, contests of strength, and the naming of our greatest warriors. I had trained my entire life for this moment, believing that at 19, I would finally earn my place among the honored few. The fire pit roared in the center of our gathering circle, surrounded by wooden benches carved from the ancient trees that gave our clan its name. The elders sat closest to the flames, their weathered faces illuminated by the dancing light, while the younger members of our tribe filled the outer rings. The air was thick with the scent of roasted venison, fermented berry wine, and the smoky incense that marked our most sacred ceremonies. My father, Thorek Blackthorn, stood before the fire as our clan's war chief. His massive frame cast a shadow that seemed to swallow half the circle, and his voice boomed across the gathering as he recounted the year's battles. He spoke of raids against the Frost Wolves, of defending our borders from the cannibalistic mountain devourers, and of the young warriors who had proven themselves worthy of recognition. I sat on the edge of my bench, my heart hammering against my ribs as I waited for my name to be called. This past year, I had led 3 successful hunting parties, tracked and killed a cave bear single-handedly, and fought alongside our warriors in 2 major battles. My spear arm was strong, my aim was true, and I had never backed down from a fight. Surely, I had earned my place among the honored. But as my father continued his recitation, calling forth warrior after warrior to receive their marks of honor, my name never came. Instead, I watched as Davin Redstone, barely 17 and still bearing the soft features of boyhood, was summoned to the fire. The crowd erupted in cheers as my father placed his hands on Davin's shoulders. "This young wolf," my father declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "has shown courage beyond his years. When the mountain devourers breached our eastern wall, while others hesitated, Davin Redstone charged into their ranks alone. He held the line until reinforcements arrived, saving countless lives through his selfless bravery." I felt my jaw clench. I had been there that day, fighting just as fiercely, but I had followed orders and maintained formation instead of breaking rank. Apparently, that discipline counted for nothing, as Davin received his warrior's mark, a ritual scar carved into his forearm with a heated blade. I caught my father's eye across the fire. For a moment, I saw something there that made my blood run cold. It wasn't disappointment or oversight. It was deliberate dismissal. The ceremony continued, but I barely heard the words. My vision had narrowed to a tunnel, focused solely on my father's broad back as he continued honoring warriors who, in my mind, had accomplished far less than I had. The wine in my cup turned bitter, and the celebration around me became a mockery. When the formal recognitions ended, the feast dissolved into smaller groups sharing stories and challenges. I found myself gravitating toward a cluster of newly honored warriors, hoping to find some camaraderie in their success. Instead, I overheard a conversation that shattered what remained of my composure. "Your father knows what he's doing," said Marcus Ironwood, one of our veteran warriors, speaking to Davin. "Some are born with the heart of a wolf, others with the heart of a lamb. Better to recognize truth than to honor pretense." Davin glanced uncomfortably in my direction, but Marcus continued, seemingly oblivious to my presence. "Cale fights well enough, but he lacks the killer instinct. He thinks too much, hesitates at crucial moments. A true warrior acts on instinct, strikes without thought. That's what separates the wolves from the sheep." The words hit me like physical blows. This was how they saw me? As a sheep among wolves? I had trained harder than anyone, suffered through punishments that would have broken lesser men, and endured trials that had left me scarred both inside and out. Yet somehow, I was still found wanting. I was contemplating a strategic retreat to nurse my wounded pride when my father's voice boomed across the gathering once more. He had taken his position by the fire again, and warriors were gathering around him, drawn by some new pronouncement. "I have watched many of you grow from boys into men," he began, his eyes scanning the circle. "Some have embraced their destiny as warriors, while others have merely played at it. Tonight, I will tell you the difference. My feet carried me forward without conscious thought, and I found myself standing at the edge of the inner circle, close enough to see the flickering firelight reflected in my father's dark eyes. "A warrior," he continued, "is not made by the strength of his arm or the sharpness of his blade. These are tools, nothing more. A warrior is made by his willingness to sacrifice everything, his comfort, his safety, his very life, for something greater than himself. A warrior does not count the cost when duty calls." He gestured toward Davin, who stood tall despite his youth. "When the mountain devourers broke through our defenses, most of our fighters responded with tactical thinking. They assessed the situation, calculated risks, and followed established protocols. This is the response of a soldier, and there is honor in it." My heart began to sink as I realized where this was heading. But Davin Redstone did not think. He saw his people in danger and acted on pure instinct. He charged into certain death without hesitation, without calculation, without fear. That is the response of a true warrior. The gathered crowd murmured their agreement, and I felt my cheeks burn with shame and anger. Was my father seriously suggesting that recklessness was more valuable than skill and discipline? "True warriors are not common," my father went on, his gaze now fixed directly on me. "They cannot be trained or manufactured. They are born with something essential that others lack. A fire that burns away all consideration of self-preservation when their tribe is threatened." I felt my hands clenching into fists at my sides. 20 years of brutal training, of pushing myself beyond every limit, of earning every skill through blood and pain. And now I was being told it meant nothing because I lacked some mystical inner fire? "Some believe that desire alone can make a warrior," my father said, and his voice carried a note of sadness that cut deeper than any insult. "They train their bodies and sharpen their weapons, thinking that dedication can replace what they were not born with. But warrior's heart cannot be learned, only revealed." The circle had grown quiet, sensing the tension in the air. I realized that every eye was on me, waiting to see how I would respond to what everyone clearly understood as a public judgment of my character. "My son Kale has trained as hard as any among us," my father continued, and I felt a brief spark of hope. "His skills are considerable, his dedication unquestionable. But he lacks the essential spark that separates a true warrior from a skilled fighter." The spark of hope died instantly, replaced by a rage so pure and consuming that it threatened to choke me. "He's the true warrior, not you," my father said, nodding toward Davin. The words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment, the world went completely silent except for the crackling of the fire. 20 years of trying to earn my father's respect, of pushing myself to excel in every aspect of warrior training, of sacrificing friendships and simple pleasures in pursuit of martial excellence. And this was his verdict. Not just that I had failed, but that I was fundamentally incapable of ever succeeding. The rage that had been building throughout the evening finally found its voice. "I challenge that judgment," I said, my words cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. My father's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained controlled. "Kale, no," I interrupted, stepping forward into the inner circle. "You want to test who has the heart of a warrior? Then let's test it properly. I challenge you to single combat before the sacred fire." The entire gathering erupted in shocked whispers. Challenging the war chief to single combat was not unheard of, but it was extraordinarily rare and carried severe consequences for the loser. More importantly, challenging one's own father added layers of complexity that made most tribal members deeply uncomfortable. My father studied me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. The disappointment was still there, but it was joined by what might have been approval, or perhaps just resignation. "You understand what you're asking for," he said quietly. "A formal challenge before the sacred fire is not a training exercise or a test of skill. It is a battle to determine truth, witnessed by the ancestors themselves. The loser does not simply admit defeat and walk away." I knew the traditions as well as anyone. In a formal challenge before the sacred fire, the loser was expected to either die in combat or accept permanent exile from the tribe. It was the ultimate test of conviction. You had to believe in your cause strongly enough to stake your entire existence on it. "I understand," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "Do you accept my challenge?" My father looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of the elders and senior warriors. I could see the internal debate playing out on their faces. Some looked scandalized by the very idea of a son challenging his father. Others seemed intrigued by the unprecedented situation. A few appeared to be calculating the political implications of whatever outcome might result. "The challenge is accepted," my father said finally. "But not tonight. Such a contest requires proper preparation and witnesses. 3 days hence, at the next full moon, we will meet in formal combat. The ancestors will judge which of us speaks the truth about the nature of warriors." The crowd began to disperse, but slowly, reluctantly. Everyone understood they had witnessed something that would be spoken of for generations, regardless of how it ended. I found myself standing alone by the fire as the last of the celebration dissolved into anxious conversations and early departures. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and escalating tension. Word of the challenge had spread throughout the tribe, and opinions were sharply divided. The older members generally supported my father, viewing my challenge as disrespectful and presumptuous. Many of the younger warriors, however, seemed to sympathize with my position, perhaps seeing their own struggles for recognition reflected in my defiance. I spent the time training with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I practiced with every weapon in our arsenal, honed my reflexes with combat drills, and pushed my body to its absolute limits. If I was going to face the most feared warrior in our tribe, I needed to be at my absolute peak. My father, meanwhile, seemed almost casual in his preparations. I occasionally saw him making adjustments to his weapons or engaging in light sparring, but he spent most of his time conducting normal tribal business, as if nothing unusual was about to occur. His confidence was either supremely professional or deeply insulting. I couldn't decide which. On the appointed night, the entire tribe gathered around a specially prepared fire pit. The flames had been built up to towering heights, fed with sacred herbs that made them burn in unnatural colors of blue and green. The elders had painted traditional symbols on the ground around the circle, marking it as a space where the ancestors themselves would bear witness to our contest. I arrived wearing my finest armor, leather reinforced with metal plates at the vital points, polished to a mirror shine. My weapons were my prized spear and a backup sword, both honed to razor sharpness. I had painted my face with the war markings of our clan, and I felt as ready as I would ever be. My father entered the circle from the opposite side, and I was struck by how different he looked. Gone was the ornate ceremonial garb of a war chief. Instead, he wore simple leather pants and a plain shirt, with minimal armor and weapons that, while clearly well-maintained, showed the wear of decades of use. He looked less like a tribal leader and more like what he had been before assuming command, a warrior who had survived more battles than any living member of our clan. The chief elder, Grandmother Stoneheart, stepped forward to officiate the challenge. Her ancient voice carried surprising strength as she recited the ritual words that would sanctify our combat. "Warriors of the Ironwood clan," she intoned, "you come before the sacred fire to settle a question of truth. The ancestors watch from beyond the veil, and they will judge the righteousness of your cause by the outcome of your battle. Fight with honor, and may the worthy prevail." She stepped back, leaving my father and me alone in the circle. Around us, the entire tribe waited in tense silence. "Last chance to withdraw," my father said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "There is no shame in recognizing that pride led you to overreach." "The only shame," I replied, raising my spear to fighting position, "would be in backing down from the truth." My father nodded, almost sadly, and drew his own weapons. A battle-axe in his right hand and a short sword in his left. It was a combination I had seen him practice with countless times, but never in actual combat. The fight began without ceremony. I had expected some formal signal, but my father simply stepped forward and swung his axe in a brutal arc aimed at my head. I barely managed to get my spear up in time to deflect the blow, and the impact sent vibrations through my entire body. I immediately realized that training with my father and fighting against him were entirely different experiences. In training, he had been teaching, holding back, showing me techniques rather than trying to kill me. Now, he was unleashing 25 years of combat experience with lethal intent, and the difference was overwhelming. His follow-up strike with the short sword nearly opened my throat, and I had to throw myself backward to avoid the blade. I stumbled, recovered, and thrust my spear toward his center mass, but he twisted aside with fluid grace and brought his axe down toward my shoulder. I managed to roll away, but not before the blade caught my armor and tore through the leather like paper. First blood went to my father, and I felt warm wetness spreading down my arm. The crowd was completely silent now, transfixed by the deadly dance playing out before them. I could feel their eyes on me, judging every move, every mistake, every sign of weakness. I tried to use my reach advantage, keeping my father at spear point distance while looking for an opening. But he had decades of experience fighting against every weapon our tribe used, and he seemed to anticipate my every attack. Worse, he was slowly but steadily working his way inside my guard, using his dual weapons to create openings while deflecting my thrusts. A particularly vicious combination nearly took my head off, and I realized I was fighting defensively, reacting rather than attacking. This was exactly the kind of tactical thinking my father had criticized. I was calculating, assessing, trying to find the perfect moment to strike instead of committing to an attack. The realization filled me with desperate fury. If I was going to lose, it wouldn't be because I fought like a sheep among wolves. I abandoned my defensive stance and launched myself forward in a reckless assault, driving my spear toward my father's chest with everything I had. The attack caught him by surprise. For just a moment, he twisted aside, but not quite fast enough, and my spear point traced a line across his ribs. It was a shallow cut, but it was blood, and it proved that he wasn't invincible. Unfortunately, my reckless attack had left me overextended and off balance. My father's counterattack came almost instantly, his axe sweeping toward my exposed side. I tried to twist away, but I was still committed to my forward momentum. The axe blade caught me in the ribs, and this time the cut was deep. I felt something vital tear, and hot blood began flowing freely down my side. Worse, the impact sent me stumbling backward, and I nearly fell into the sacred fire. I managed to catch myself at the last second, but now I was wounded, winded, and fighting with my back to the flames. My father advanced methodically, his weapons weaving a pattern of death that seemed impossible to penetrate. "Yield," he said quietly, speaking for the first time since the combat began. "You've proven your courage. No one will question your heart after this. No, I gasped, raising my spear despite the agony in my side. You said I lack the killer instinct. Let's find out. I feinted high with my spear, then suddenly reversed the motion and swept low, trying to take his legs out from under him. It was a move I had practiced thousands of times, and for a moment, I thought it might work. But my father had taught me that move. He jumped over my sweep, spun in midair, and brought his axe down in a devastating overhead strike that I barely managed to deflect. The impact drove me to one knee, and I felt my strength beginning to fail. That's when I noticed something that changed everything. In the firelight, I could see that my father was breathing heavily, and there was a slight tremor in his left hand. The cut I had given him was bleeding more freely than it should have been, and his movements, while still deadly, had lost some of their earlier fluidity. He was getting tired. More than that, he was hurt worse than he was letting on. My spear thrust had done more damage than either of us had initially realized. For the first time since the fight began, I allowed myself to hope. If I could last long enough, if I could avoid any more serious wounds, I might actually have a chance. I forced myself back to my feet and resumed my defensive stance, but now I was watching for signs of fatigue, looking for the moment when his guard would drop just enough for me to exploit his injury. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. My father launched another combination attack, but this time his left-hand sword moved just a fraction slower than it should have. I saw the opening and took it, driving my spear toward the gap in his defense. The point took him in the shoulder, and this time the wound was serious. His left arm dropped, and for a moment, he was fighting one-handed while blood flowed freely from the puncture. But even wounded, he was still the most dangerous opponent I had ever faced. His right-hand axe came around in a horizontal slice that would have decapitated me if I hadn't ducked under it. I tried to capitalize on his momentary imbalance, but he recovered faster than seemed humanly possible and nearly opened my skull with a backhand stroke. We were both bleeding now, both wounded, both exhausted. The fight had lasted far longer than either of us had probably expected, and the crowd around us was no longer silent. I could hear voices calling out, some urging me on, others shouting warnings or advice. But I was beyond hearing them. My world had narrowed to the space inside the circle, to the deadly dance between my father and me, to the burning question of whether I had what it took to be a true warrior. That's when my father did something that caught me completely off guard. Instead of pressing his advantage while I was distracted by the crowd, he stepped back and lowered his weapons. "Look around you, Kale," he said, his voice carrying despite his labored breathing. "Look at your tribe." Against every instinct, I glanced at the faces surrounding us. What I saw there shocked me. There was no longer any division between those who had supported me and those who had supported my father. Every face showed the same expression, desperate concern, not for the outcome of the fight, but for both of us. "Do you see it now?" my father asked. "Do you understand what you've accomplished?" I didn't understand. I was still focused on the fight, still trying to determine if this was some kind of trick to lower my guard. 3 days ago, my father continued, half this tribe saw you as an untested youth playing at being a warrior. Tonight, you stand before them covered in blood, yours and mine, having proven that you would rather die than accept a judgment you believed was unjust. Do you think anyone here still questions your heart? I looked around the circle again, and this time I really saw the faces of my people. There was no mockery there, no dismissal. Even those who had opposed my challenge were looking at me with something that might have been respect. "But that's not the real test," my father said, and his voice carried a strange note of sadness. "The real test is what you do next. Do you press your advantage while I'm wounded? Do you try to kill your own father to prove a point? Or do you show the wisdom to recognize when honor has been satisfied?" For the first time since the fight began, I really looked at my father, not as an opponent to be defeated, but as the man who had raised me, trained me, and shaped me into whatever I had become. The man who was now bleeding from 2 serious wounds that I had inflicted. The rage that had driven me to issue the challenge was gone, replaced by something much more complex. I understood now what he had been trying to tell me, not just tonight, but throughout my entire life. Being a warrior wasn't about proving your courage through reckless action. It was about having the strength to do what was right, even when it cost you everything you thought you wanted. Slowly, I lowered my spear and stepped back. "I yield," I said quietly. The crowd erupted in voices, some approving, others confused, a few clearly disappointed that the fight was ending without a decisive conclusion. But my father's expression showed something I had never seen there before when he looked at me. Pride. "You do not yield," he said, raising his voice so the entire tribe could hear. "You have proven everything that needed proving. The challenge is satisfied, and both warriors have shown honor." Grandmother Stoneheart stepped forward, her ancient voice carrying across the suddenly quiet gathering. "The ancestors have judged," she declared. "Both warriors have shown courage, both have shed blood in service of truth, and both have demonstrated the wisdom to recognize when honor has been satisfied. Let no one question the heart of either fighter." The crowd began to cheer, but I barely heard them. I was focused on my father, who was now leaning heavily on his axe, his face pale from blood loss. "Why?" I asked him as the tribe began to disperse and the healers approached to tend our wounds. "Why did you have to push me to this?" My father smiled, and for once, there was no disappointment in his expression. "Because you needed to discover for yourself what you were capable of. I could have told you 1,000 times that you had the heart of a warrior, but you wouldn't have believed me. You needed to prove it to yourself and to everyone else." As the healers began working on our wounds, I realized that something fundamental had changed, not just in how the tribe saw me, but in how I saw myself. I had faced the ultimate test and discovered that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. More importantly, I had learned that true strength sometimes meant knowing when not to use it. "The real lesson," my father said as the healer stitched his shoulder wound, "is that being a warrior isn't about never showing fear or never thinking tactically. It's about doing what needs to be done regardless of the cost. Tonight, you proved you were willing to risk everything. Your life, your place in the tribe, even your relationship with me, for what you believed was right. That's the heart of a true warrior." I winced as the healer cleaned the deep cut in my ribs, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional turmoil of the past few days. "So when you said I wasn't a warrior, I said you weren't the same kind of warrior as Davin," my father corrected. "He's a berserker, all instinct and fury. That has its place in battle, but it's not the only way to serve the tribe. You're a different kind of warrior, one who thinks, who plans, who considers the consequences of his actions. Tonight, you proved you could combine that tactical mind with the courage to act when necessary." The healers finished their work, and gradually the crowd dispersed, leaving us alone by the dying fire. The sacred flames had burned down to normal proportions, but the space still felt charged with significance. "So what happens now?" I asked. My father looked at me thoughtfully. "Now you have a choice to make. You could take this victory and use it to challenge my leadership, to claim the position of war chief through combat. It would be within your rights, and after tonight, you would have the support of many in the tribe." The suggestion caught me off guard. I hadn't even considered that possibility, but now that he mentioned it, I could see how tonight's events could be interpreted that way. "Or," he continued, "you could accept the position I've been preparing you for all along, not as war chief, but as something equally important. Our tribe's strategic leader, the one who plans our campaigns and coordinates our defenses, the one who thinks 3 moves ahead, while others are focused on the immediate battle." I stared at him in shock. You've been preparing me for a leadership position? Why do you think I pushed you so hard? Why do you think I demanded tactical thinking even when others praised instinctive action? I've been war chief for 15 years, Kale. I've seen enough battles to know that we need both kinds of warriors. The berserkers who charge into danger without thought, and the strategists who make sure they're charging in the right direction. The pieces were starting to fall into place. All those years of training, all the emphasis on discipline and tactical thinking, all the criticism of my supposed lack of warrior instinct. It had all been preparation for a role I hadn't even known existed. But why the public humiliation? Why make me challenge you in front of the entire tribe? My father smiled ruefully. Because no one follows a leader they don't respect, and no one respects a leader who hasn't been tested. After tonight, when you give orders in battle, our warriors will follow them without question. They've seen that you're willing to fight for what you believe in, that you can stand toe-to-toe with the best of us, and that you have the wisdom to know when enough is enough. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything that had happened. 3 days ago, I had been a frustrated young warrior desperate for recognition. Tonight, I was being offered a position of leadership I had never dreamed of. There's one more thing you need to understand, my father said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. The Mountain Devourers aren't finished with us. Our scouts report massive troop movements in the eastern peaks. What we've faced so far has been nothing compared to what's coming. We're going to need every advantage we can get, including leaders who can think strategically under pressure. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. This wasn't just about personal recognition anymore. It was about the survival of our entire tribe. I accept, I said quietly. My father nodded, and I could see relief in his expression. Good. Your first assignment is to figure out how to defend against an enemy that outnumbers us 5-1 and has no regard for their own casualties. Think you can handle that? Despite everything that had happened, I found myself smiling. I'll need to study their tactics, analyze their previous attacks, and develop countermeasures that play to our strengths while exploiting their weaknesses. There's the tactical thinking I've been waiting to see, my father said with approval. But remember what you learned tonight. Sometimes the best strategy is knowing when to throw caution to the wind and trust your instincts. As we walked back toward the village, both of us limping from our wounds, I realized that the evening's events had taught me something far more valuable than any combat technique or military strategy. I had learned that being a warrior wasn't about conforming to someone else's definition of courage or strength. It was about finding your own way to serve your people, whether that meant charging blindly into battle or carefully planning the campaign that would save their lives. The tribal feast had ended hours ago, but in many ways, my real education was just beginning. I had proven I could fight, but now I had to prove I could lead. And with the Mountain Devourers gathering their forces in the east, I would have that opportunity sooner than I might have wished. But for the first time in my life, I felt truly ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. I had faced the ultimate test and discovered reserves of strength and courage I hadn't known I possessed. More importantly, I had learned that the heart of a true warrior wasn't measured by the absence of fear or thought, but by the willingness to act in spite of both when duty demanded it. The sacred fire burned low behind us as we entered the village, but its light would stay with me forever. A reminder of the night I stopped trying to be the warrior others expected me to be, and finally became the warrior I was meant to be. My name is Kale Blackthorn, and I am a warrior. Not because I never feel fear, not because I act without thinking, but because when my people need me, I will be there. Whether that means planning the perfect strategy or throwing myself into hopeless battle, I will do whatever it takes to protect those I serve. And now, finally, I understand what my father was trying to teach me all along. The true measure of a warrior isn't found in how they fight, but in why they fight. Everything else is just technique.